Great. Well, good morning, everybody, or should I say good evening from Washington, D.C. This is a global SIPE event being coordinated from Washington and our regional office in Manila. My name is Andrew Wilson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for International Private Enterprise, or SIPE, as you'll hear us refer to it throughout our deliberations today. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining SIPE's webinar on co-regulation of digital transformation in Asia. Today's webinar is the first of a series of 3 that will tackle themes of technology and democracy in Asia. SIPE is also taking this opportunity to introduce its new office in Manila under the direction of Ryan Evangelista, who many of you have gotten to know and work with over the years. SIPE's representative office in the Philippines serves as a strategic hub for SIPE's program activities all across Asia Pacific. And as a hub, SIPE Philippines fosters knowledge sharing, project management, thought leadership, and stakeholder cooperation to respond to the emerging democracy landscape in the region. More specifically, SIPE's Philippines office supports SIPE's broader thematic work where issues of democracy and business mix. Areas such as women's economic empowerment, anti-corruption and governance, trade facilitation, ethical and responsible investments, infrastructure and procurement transparency, freedom of information, gender diversity and inclusion, business association and strengthening, and of course, the subject of today's event, technology and the digital economy. Our Manila office will shepherd resource sharing among SIPE's network in the Asia Pacific region to support coalition building and in-country and joint regional advocacy, enabling country-specific actors to become leading regional voices for market reform and private sector development. And we're very happy to hit the ground running with this timely activity. We're honored today to have Assistant Secretary Mary Jean Pacheco and all of our panelists joining us to discuss the critical issue of digital transformation in the region. SIPE has been working on digital economy, digital trade, and inclusive economic development for several years now. However, the urgency of getting digital business and governance right in the age of COVID-19 couldn't be any clearer. Entrepreneurship and business growth increasingly require not only tech innovation and access, but governance systems that promote privacy, security, and ease of technological adoption. The scope of digital innovation and rise of commerce in Southeast Asia, and in Indonesia in particular, is also an opportunity to improve cooperation and dialogue between government and business to ensure the digital transformation of the economy does not leave segments of the economy and society behind. Democratic dialogue and flexible frameworks can help ensure that laws and regulations meet the challenges and opportunities of tomorrow's technologies. And the private sector, including business organizations and economic think tanks, have an important role in advocating for an enabling environment that promotes entrepreneurship, inclusion, and pushes back against digital authoritarianism, surveillance, and misguided attempts to limit civic engagement on and offline. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and we look forward to welcoming you to our upcoming events. It's now my great pleasure to turn the emceeing of this session over to Luisa Tomar, who will moderate today's session. Luisa, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. And hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning and good evening to you all. My name is Luisa Tomar. I'm a Global Program Officer at SIPE, and I'm delighted to be moderating the first of our webinar series on democracy and technology in Asia, as well as to help launch our new Manila office. I'd first like to take a moment to thank Ryan Evangelista and my colleagues in the Manila office for their excellent work putting on today's program. I've been working on SIPE's digital economy portfolio for some time, but certainly in the wake of COVID-19, we've seen a rapid expansion of the use of technological tools and new e-commerce plans from many governments around the globe as they see their businesses struggle to adopt new tools and move their businesses online. And this is especially important for SMEs and entrepreneurs and those business communities outside of major cities and capitals. And so we really care about making sure that enabling environment for digital transformation is inclusive of a broad cross-section of the economy. And in order to do so, we've seen that national and regional policies and regulations really need to be developed in coordination between government, industry, and civil society. That's why today's online discussion on co-regulation will offer perspectives on how business and government can cooperate effectively to advance inclusive digital transformation and leverage new flexible approaches in order to ensure that the regulation and policy systems in place allow for competitiveness, inclusiveness, and address the needs of a fast digitalizing consumer market base. For a bit of housekeeping, we will begin with 10-minute presentations from the panelists, followed by questions I've prepared for all of the speakers. We will also have a 20-minute Q&A with the audience, and I ask that you please use the Q&A box on the Zoom screen to send in your questions, and we'll do our best to answer all of them. Finally, my colleague Ryan Evangelista will close us out with some final thoughts. Please note that this session is being recorded and streamed live, and we will be sharing the presentation of our panelists. Today's speakers include Ms. Mary Jean Pacheco, Assistant Secretary of Digital Philippines and E-Commerce at the Department of Trade and Industry in the Philippines. Dr. Roberto Martin Galang, Robbie, Operations Officer at the International Finance Corporation at the World Bank, and Ms. Felippa Amanta, Head of Research at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies based in Jakarta, Indonesia. I will now turn it over to Asek Jean to begin her presentation to tell us more about the e-commerce plan by the Philippines government. Asek Jean?
Good morning, Luisa, and good evening, Andrew, and to everyone in the world. Hello, magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. And congratulations, Ryan. It's again a pleasure every time I meet with Ryan. It's a privilege. So I think I am quite fortunate that to be invited here in SIPE. And you know, on the 29th of January, so I'm presenting something that's straight from the oven. Last January 29, we, the DTI, launched the e-commerce, the updated roadmap. It's the e-commerce Philippines 2022 roadmap. And in the interest of time, I'll just have 3 slides that I think are the most important slides. This is really our, this slide is the summary slide. It's what I call our narrative slide. You know, in the strategy, one of the strategies that you'll see in the map is to undertake a massive communication campaign across business and market segments under a unified e-commerce narrative. I'd like to start by focusing on this particular side. In one page, I'll tell you the story of the Philippine e-commerce strategy and our key messages to consumers, to businesses, whether they're micro, small, medium, or large, to government, and to the enablers. The narrative actually highlights our mission to ensure speed, enhance security, establish structure to achieve sales. So it's a very simple formula. Speed is important. We want to stress the importance of making the onboarding experience easy for online sellers, whether they join any platform or they have their own websites. We want these online businesses to be digitally enabled so they can maximize the potential that e-commerce brings to the business. We also need an integrated logistics support system to ensure fast and efficient delivery. We know that speed is an e-commerce characteristic that works well for businesses and more so with consumers. On the part of online consumers, you buy, you pay, then it's delivered to you. And you know, it's so much fun, especially for people like me. During the pandemic, you know, patience is really the least of my virtues. So queuing in the grocery is not exactly my cup of tea. So during the pandemic, can you imagine? I probably was the happiest person because when you just order your grocery, then it comes to your doorstep. Then I have PayMaya, I have GCash, and I use InstaPay all the time. So the use of digital payments under the plan is important as a it is an integral component, an integral element to a successful e-commerce. So the use of digital payments must be advocated because really it's a lot faster, more efficient, and actually safe. So let's talk about, speaking of safe, the infographic. If you look at the infographic, you see that there's a certain cloak that surrounds, no? This is the security that it provides, no? People are actually afraid to transact over the internet. The fear is, against invasion of privacy, or maybe a risk, no, to being victims against cybercrime or fraud. And that's very, very common to us Filipinos and around the world. So that is the main problem that we in government are setting our sights on. So we do this either through policy, information, advocacy, or enforcement. We are actually for engagement and to a large degree self-regulation. And I see that that is really the topic and the theme of SIPE's engagement in these webinars. I am so I'm so excited to tell you how it came along. But you can see that in the plan we are really plan is really a strong private collaboration between private sector and government. So let's talk about, for example, on security, like for example on the part of brand owners. They need to secure intellectual property. As we speak, the intellectual property of the Philippines, we have a very dynamic director general who is now focusing on a memorandum of agreement between the brand owners and the platforms. And this is so that the industry themselves will agree. This is a very innovative and a proactive way in exploring ways to engage to discourage infringement. So this is something that government is just watching for, but it really is about the private sector working together, and DTI or IPO in this case is really facilitating. So now we need to inform our kababayans that we all need to do our share to build a foundation, and that is structure. I attended a World Bank report study on the digital economy, and it did say that sometimes digital economy and the e-commerce are interchangeably used. But when I saw structure, it's like building digital Philippines. On the part of the public sector, government must streamline, automate, and integrate. It's not enough for one agency of government to be automated. It has to make sure that the other agencies of government, national and government, should likewise automate, because we need to talk to each other. So we are introducing an all of e-government approach. I know that we are all very familiar with whole of government, but we're trying to put a little bit of a spin. So we now are saying it's all of e-government. And this is a vision. There are already existing laws with that. Infrastructure must be pursued, and responsive tariff and taxation policies must be explained. So we really are working with the private sector because private sector are encouraged really to invest in the Filipino. Innovation is essential. Self-regulation is ideal, as we really heard from the e-commerce platforms. Lastly, we really want to advocate for upskilling, reskilling, and reminders on our value system, our ethics. E-commerce sometimes encourages misdemeanors, which contribute to breakdown in trust. And finally, we also want to make sure that we have a data set. There are information that is available. We need to collect relevant data so government can come up with informed decisions. So speed, structure, and security. Speed, security, and structure is equals to sales is actually a very simple formula. Whether it's domestic or cross-border, what we want in simple terms is we want more businesses, and we want more consumers. We want you to buy online and to spend more online. So that, in effect, is the story of the e-commerce roadmap. Now, I hope I'll just make it quick, but I'd like to share the strategy of the roadmap, which is quite simple, and I think it's something that can be useful to the audience. And we're very proud because this is really a product not just of government, not just of TTI, but again from the private sector themselves. The vision was very well laid out to them. Our shared vision is that by 2030, e-commerce in the Philippines is plug and play, safe, reliable, easy, and efficient everywhere. For the Filipino, e-commerce and commerce are indistinguishable. In line with this vision, our mission is to ensure speed, to enhance security, to establish structure in order to expand sales. To accomplish this mission, we need resources. We shall ensure that budgetary support is provided to fund e-commerce initiatives. And with resources, we also need an organization. Government shall form a strong e-commerce bureau that will champion the whole of government approach, institutionalize public-private sector partnership to boost e-commerce growth, and pursue an advanced knowledge management system that is responsive to both government and business needs. With resources and organization in place, the following strategies must be pursued. Accelerate government efforts in creating a secure, reliable, efficient, and affordable network of ICT services. Initiate an e-commerce logistic infrastructure and investment convergence program. Speed up e-government initiatives across the e-commerce ecosystem. Pursue a future-ready, inclusive, and enabling regulatory environment. Promote cashless transactions and increase uptake of digital payments, fast track the resolution of complaints and actions against e-commerce fraud and IP data privacy violations, scale up the digital transformation of micro, small, medium enterprises, support funding for e-commerce innovation and technology investments, increase B2B e-commerce transactions, advance cooperation on cross-border digital trade, upskill and reskill Philippine talent to support e-commerce growth, and undertake a massive communication campaign across business and market segments against under a unified e-commerce narrative. These strategies, when successfully pursued, will result in the availability of digitally skilled workers or more employment, more digitally enabled enterprise, and empowered online consumers, which we hope will really increase e-commerce contribution to the economy. So that's really the story of the e-commerce roadmap. And of course, we need to be measured with some metrics. Next slide, please. Essentially, of course, we'd like to have an increase in the share, but I'd like to focus more here on our basic aspiration or goal, which is to have more e-commerce online sellers and really happier consumers. So if we have about 500 now, we hope to get 1 million by end of the plan. That's 1 million online merchants. And of course, we want Google measures gross merchandise value. So we also want to make sure that an empowered consumer means they buy more. So we hope to really increase that from 7.5 billion to about 16 billion by end of the plan. So there, Luis, I hope I am very happy to really share with you the very, very recent, and as I said, coming off from the oven, the e-commerce roadmap. So thank you very much for this opportunity, Sai. By the way, because we are e-commerce, yes, you can, if you're interested to know more, we decided to just do a web report. We have a web report. So if you want details of the roadmap, just click ecommerce.dti.gov.ph. Madali, because our tagline is Basta e-commerce, madali. That's fast or convenient, and it also stands for market access, digitalization, and logistics integration. So again, thank you very much, Sai.
Thank you so much, Asak Jean. That was an excellent presentation and a very ambitious plan. And I do have follow-up questions for you. But before I do, I'd like to turn it over to Robbie to discuss a bit from his perspective at the IFC.
Thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity. Let me just share my screen. Wait, sorry. Let me just share my screen again. So good morning, everyone. Thank you again for SIPE for organizing this. We're always very glad to be able to present our findings to a group as diverse as what we have this morning. We're also very glad to speak right after ASIC Jean. ASIC Jean is one of our partners for years. We've been working with DTI on different agenda, especially on logistics, which is my topic for this morning. We're also very glad to be able to support the e-commerce roadmap that the DTI is pushing through. Unfortunately, while the ASIC Jean has presented all the exciting things about e-commerce, this presentation will be slightly less exciting because it talks about the part of e-commerce that tends to be forgotten, which is the logistics. We know that the Philippines has a very booming e-commerce roadmap, as well as now an e-commerce um, industry. The digital economy has really increased a lot, especially since the pandemic has started. A lot more people have gone on Shopee, Lazada, Grab, Instagram to sell, and the projections are just escalating, especially as we have now the government really focused on ensuring, security, speed, and all the other requirements for e-commerce. But unfortunately, compared with our neighbors, e-commerce revenue and penetration is still quite low in the Philippines. Even our user penetration rates has not reached what our neighbors have been able to achieve, let's say in Indonesia or in Vietnam or Malaysia. And so we have quite a long way to go. And part of the reason why this exists is because of the logistics part that underplays the e-commerce. While it's nice to be able to order many things online from the comfort of our home, there is actually a low tech or a real world engine for these virtual transactions, right? While it's so exciting to have a lot of these things done via phone or even better, via clicks with digital payments, many times we have to wait for the courier to arrive. And the physical goods will actually need to be sorted, sent, delivered, inventoried, and and brought to our homes, right? So we still need to focus, especially on small parcel logistics, which is the real world engine for a lot of these virtual transactions. And so, um, in conventional versus e-commerce logistics, there's quite a significant difference, right? Because for conventional logistics, and we're talking about companies like LBC or DHL, many times these goods, are sent from the distribution centers, go straight to the retailers, and it's us as customers who go to these retail stores, whether they're convenience stores, whether they're supermarkets, or whether they're the large big box retail shops. But for e-commerce, the logistics is very, very different, right? So you have a number of e-tailers, some of which are customers themselves. And when the orders are placed, they could be sent to the distribution centers, or you have a lot of parcel delivery companies that bring the goods individually from the warehouse or from the individual e-tailers all the way to the different individual customers. So this increases the complexity of the logistics distribution path because it's no longer from a large company to a smaller branch of the company, but we're talking now about small and large enterprises selling and distributing and inventorying goods to many, many disparate customers nationwide. And so you do have a lot more entities coming here to do this work, companies that have started working harder this past few months, companies like Food Panda, Lala Move, that have joined the FedEx, DHLs, and LBCs of the world to be able to really enter this this highly important market, right? And of course, one of the other things that has been here for quite some time and it plays a very strong role in the promotion of e-commerce is actually the Philippine Postal Service. So the difference between courier services and other logistics companies is that while the logistics companies tend to be regulated by the Department of Trade and Industry as well as the Department of Transportation. For courier services, they're actually called express delivery or messenger services, and they're regulated by another entity, the Department of Information and Communications Technology, because most of them are under the Philippine Postal Services Act, which is actually a communications rather than a transportation technology. So therefore, while a motorbike and delivery truck seem to have the same platform of delivery, they're actually regulated by two different agencies. One is under the Department of Transport, and the other one is in the Department of Communications. And because of this, the regulation is treated differently. While domestic logistics is still considered a public utility, um, the way that the DICT has been regulating courier services has a lot more flexibility, which is why we have a lot more courier services choices today, as opposed to logistics companies, which has a lot more stringent requirements. And secondly, although domestic logistics is indeed the public utilities, there is need to provide better clarity in defining which particular logistic services are classified as public utilities and therefore close to majority owned foreign investors. And secondly, there is a great need to expand the services provided by PhilPost, or the Philippine Postal Services. The Philippine Postal Corporation plays a very essential role in the transport of goods nationwide. Uh, they are a member of the Universal Postal Union, which means that PhilPost provides domestic delivery services for packages arriving in the Philippines from international postal offices. What does this mean? This means that if you order something from abroad and it is sent by the US Postal Services or Deutsche Post, the entity that will be delivering that item from the port to your house is PhilPost. So because of this, they play quite an important role, right? And secondly, they are mandated by law to serve low-volume missionary areas, or basically the far-flung islands and barangays of our country that are too far to be served by private operators. So what this means is that even the private companies like DHL or LBC could be very dependent on the Philippine Postal Service if the entity involved is a far-flung barangay or an island that is not served by their couriers. And while the Postal Service is accorded with many tax exemptions and agency-to-agency agreements, many government and even private companies no longer use them. So as such, their performance remains to be seen. Their market share currently is quite low at 12%, even though they're the only entity that is able to serve a lot of the isolated communities, primarily because there is a great need to really improve their services. It is not unknown that PhilPost has quite lack of on-time delivery. There are many instances where a letter or a package is delivered to PhilPost but does not arrive in the final destination for weeks or even months. And so this is why the limited reliability of the postal services creates a drag on our e-commerce uh, base, primarily as what Asik said, no, speed is of quite importance, and if there's a limited reliability for the postal service, this could slow down the rollout of internet services. And finally, the third leg of small parcels logistics is customs clearances. With the Bureau of Customs now having passed the CMTA, or the Customs Modernization and Tariff Act, e-commerce is now the e-commerce modernization can actually be supported by a lot of these Philippine laws. However, some of these implementing rules will still need to be issued. We are working with the Bureau of Customs today to be able to pass the express services uh, customs modern customs orders, so that there is a lot more clarity on express deliveries. The Philippines has increased its de minimis threshold to 10,000 pesos, meaning that packages $200 and below can clear customs much faster. However, there still remains a lack of clear procedures for goods that are rejected or returned. So if you receive a package from abroad that you don't like, how easy it is to get a refund or to send it back, right? So these procedures remain to be cleared. And as I mentioned, this is not something that the Bureau of Customs in the Philippines is grappling with by itself. The whole world, especially now with COVID, is dealing with a deluge of e-commerce packages. And so there is a greater need to really clarify a lot of these regulations around customs clearances. When you put two and two together, when goods have to clear through customs as well as be delivered through field post, a lot of the issues start to appear, right? So a lot of customs packages do clear via field post in Manila. However, if these goods are destined for other parts of the country, especially Cebu and Davao, sometimes these will have to be cleared twice. First in the Central Exchange Center in Manila, and then in the provinces where the goods are finally destined to be delivered. Right. Many times these duties and taxes have to be paid for in the post office, which means that instead of waiting for your package to come to your home, you may actually have to go to the nearest field post center to be able to pay and take your package with you. And sometimes, because of the lack of tracking, it is sometimes difficult to figure out which field post entity has received your package and therefore where you're supposed to pick them up. So there is a greater need to integrate the customs and postal service clearance system so that we can really have a more seamless, especially electronic and international e-commerce market. And so finally, we do have a number of policy recommendations so that we can improve and enhance our e-commerce sector, especially the logistics that underplays this system. So first is that it would be good to be able to pass the Public Services Act amendment so that we can finally eliminate the lack of clarity in what entities are really public utilities, and especially if we can eliminate the foreign ownership restrictions in the logistics sector. This will allow for many firms to be able to come into the market, especially the very innovative firms that have been able to provide international e-commerce logistics services to different entities abroad. Right, it would be good to have access to their new technologies in the country. Second, it would be integral that the CMTA regulations, especially for e-commerce and cross-border transactions, be passed and certified. We need, of course, to revitalize Philpost because they really have a strong role to play as the anchor for our parcel delivery services, especially for remote communities. We want our e-commerce system to be very inclusive, not just for the remote communities to be recipients of e-commerce goods, but we also want them to participate and become producers so that they can not only access Manila or the large cities like Cebu and Davao, but they can also access the whole world, be able to sell goods from Lake Cebu or from Ifugao all the way to Switzerland or to the United States, right? But that requires a very strong postal service to be able to complete that. We also need to clarify the regulations around small parcel delivery, especially within the DICT. It would be good to have an information campaign to SMEs to encourage e-commerce trading, but I think this is already part of the Madali roadmap. We're very glad that this is being integrated to that. And we're also happy to hear that more investment support for the e-commerce, especially for logistics investments, will be coming. And finally, again, the roadmap is there. So we're here to really support DTI in generating more policies to facilitate e-commerce, especially on the export side. And so on that note, again, we're very grateful for this chance to be able to present this this discussion during this discussion, and we're happy to hear and listen to your questions and provide some of the answers in this discussion. So thank you very much, and we look forward to this discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robbie. That's really interesting. You bring up a lot of important points on logistics and the customs clearance process. Before we jump into questions, I want to switch gears slightly to introduce our partner in Indonesia, Felippa, Amanta, and the work they've been doing at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. Indonesia's one of the largest, if not the largest, e-commerce market in Southeast Asia and continuing to grow. And they've recently published a policy paper about co-regulation. So I'm very curious to hear what they've seen in their research. So let me turn it over to you, Felippa.
Thank you so much, Luisa, and thank you, Saib, for having us today. And congratulations as well for Saib and Ryan for the new Manila office. We're very happy and excited to be working closely again after this. Let me share my screen. As Luisa said, this presentation is really the insights from our recently published research on co-regulating the Indonesian digital economy. For this presentation, I have three messages that I wanted to convey today. First, we find that consumer protection, data privacy, cybersecurity, and e-payments are really essentially priority areas that must be strengthened to facilitate further growth of the digital economy. But that begs the big question, how can we then regulate or govern these four areas? We want to argue, secondly, that co-regulation can help effectively regulate these four areas. It's a new term, but it really emphasizes responsibility sharing between state and non-state actors, such as private sector stakeholders in policy making, as well as enforcement. This is still abstract, so we wanted to put it in more practical terms. How can we encourage co-regulation? And we want to argue that we can facilitate co-regulation through public-private dialogue, as well as regulatory sandbox and monitoring and evaluation. So to give a backdrop of the Indonesian digital economy, as Luisa mentioned, we are indeed the biggest digital economy in ASEAN. Our annual value has grown about 40% annually since 2015, and now it's reaching about 41% of total transactions in digital economy in ASEAN. So it's quite huge, and the business to consumer e-commerce market alone is worth $13.6 billion in 2019. We know that it's just grown since the pandemic. Transactions during COVID-19 have increased by 42%. So digital economy is such an important economic space that benefits not only consumers as they have access to wider options, but also micro small businesses, women entrepreneurs, and marginalized community to be able to access the digital economy and conduct economic activities there. We highlighted four priority areas for an enabling environment, and this one we adapted from Saib's wonderful digital economy enabling environment guide that Luisa edited. These four areas are consumer protection, cybersecurity, data privacy, and e-payment. These are very distinct areas, but yet interlinked, and together they affect nearly all aspects and activities conducted in an online business and digital economy. So the big question for today is, how can we effectively govern or regulate these areas to ensure that innovations will still grow while consumers are being protected adequately? Generally, there are three regulatory approaches. You have the state-controlled one, which is a more traditional top-down approach where states designed and set the regulations and then impose them on private sector industries. On the other hand, you also have self-regulation, where there are minimal government intervention. Not absence, there are still government interventions and regulations, but largely the regulating is delegated to the industry, where they can set their own rules and have their own code of conduct that they follow. We wanted to argue that rather than either a state control or a self-regulation, co-regulation might be the best approach to address unique challenges in digital economy policymaking. So co-regulation, which is a sharing of responsibility between state and non-state actors in policymaking and enforcement. There are a unique approach that can address many of the challenges faced when we're designing policy in the digital economy. Some of the benefits of co-regulation is that it addresses asymmetric or incomplete information. We know that in the digital economy, usually the industries are very in tune with the newer innovation, what's happening in data management, including consumer data, whereas the government usually lack information or access to that information. So by having co-regulation, you can have a sharing of data insights that can inform policymaking. Secondly, it allows for flexible adaptation of solutions. Speed, as has been mentioned by previous panelists, is really key to digital economy. Though the rapid change of innovations and new startups that are appearing are very rapid, and unfortunately, the policy making process usually cannot keep up because they tend to be slower, very bureaucratic. So having co-regulation can allow regulators to be updated and allows for flexible adaptation and very timely regulatory making. Last but not least, it also facilitates regulatory enforcement. Just given the size of the digital economy, is almost impossible or very hard, and it will be very ineffective for government to be the only one monitoring and enforcing all of the regulations, for example, consumer protection mechanisms. So by delegating some of the enforcement responsibility to private sector, it can actually facilitate enforcement to make sure that the regulations are implemented properly. It does have some disadvantages. For example, it can be quite costly, having all of the dialogues, having transaction costs, and it has a certain risk of bias participation, especially towards bigger companies and industries. And it is harder to evaluate just because of the nature of it, very adaptive and evolving. But given the disadvantages, we know and we see that the benefits are way greater than disadvantages. So we still wanted to argue that co-regulation might be an approach, a potential approach to try. So now pulling back from the abstract to more practical terms, what is exactly co-regulation? They have two different tools that we want to propose. The first one is public-private dialogue. And by this, we don't mean just the one-off public input when you're making the policy making, but rather a continuous process, a continuous and adaptive process where private sectors, industries, civil societies are included when the governments are creating, designing the policy making, as well as later on when policy makings are being implemented, enforced, and evaluated. That's the first one. The second tool is a regulatory sandbox, which is a safe space for industry to play and test out and experiment their new products and services within a certain boundaries without having to immediately face rigid regulations. So we find that regulatory sandbox can increase innovations, and which we'll, I guess, talk about later in the question and answer. Now, I want to present the case study of Indonesia and how co-regulation might play out. Our own digital economy regulatory framework right now is quite fragmented. It's spread out all of those four areas: consumer protection, data privacy, cybersecurity, and e-payments are spread out across 14 different ministries and agencies and more than 60 laws and regulations. For consumer protection, for example, we have an old law, General Consumer Protection Law from 1999, which, because e-commerce wasn't a big thing back then, it doesn't have e-commerce provisions. We do have recently an e-commerce regulation that has been passed with public and private dialogue as well. But yet the regulations still lack provisions on newer business models, for example, drop shipping. This highlights that problem in the digital economy where new business models keep popping up faster than regulations can create the regulations. And then to protect consumers, the government then decided to implement a new licensing requirement so that all of the sellers, online sellers, are now being tracked and monitored. But yet these kinds of regulations have a risk of putting a barrier for micro and small businesses to enter the market. On the data privacy, moving on, in Indonesia, there is no specific regulations yet, and it's fragmented across 32 different regulations, which results in overlapping and sometimes conflicting provisions, for example, on what kinds of data are actually personal data, how can you manage data properly. Some of the regulations even have provisions like data localization, which can be costly and burdensome for businesses. We currently are in the process of deliberating on a personal data protection bill, which we hope to be passed this year. And thankfully, the process have really involved policy, public-private dialogue with private sectors and civil society. But this is something that we're still keeping an eye on. Lastly, on the two other focus areas, cybersecurity is similar to data privacy. There are no regulations yet, no dedicated and comprehensive law. There was an effort to publish a cybersecurity and cyber resilience bill, but then it was criticized for insufficient public consultations, which results in provisions that are hard to implement for businesses or might be even risky for consumers. The more innovative sector have been e-payments. So e-payments in Indonesia have grown massively. Just between 2018 and 2020, electronic money transfers have grown by 300%. So this has been a result of very innovative approach in regulating the sector itself, allowing for more innovations and businesses to pop up. The e-payments are now managed under the Financial Services Authority and the central bank. And they've implemented some sort of regulatory sandbox on new e-payment services, allowing companies to try out and experiment their products and services. And they have close cooperations with associations, and the associations have a code of conduct, so that can be updated much more easily and can be implemented by the association members. So to sum up, these four sectors are on different spectrums on where they lie in terms of the regulatory approach. Some are very much still state controlled, some are more co-regulated. And because of that, we finally, we have a few recommendations to hopefully regulate all of these four sectors through a co-regulatory approach. The first one is we argue and we recommend to integrate public-private dialogue in policy making process across those four sectors, but not just any public-private dialogue. It has to consider continuity as well, not just only in the beginning, but throughout the process up until finalizing and implementing the process, and making sure the public-private dialogue are inclusive, reaching out smaller, small businesses as well, and effective, making sure that the results of the dialogue are actually informing the policy making and being adapted to the policies. And then we also recommend increasing use of regulatory sandbox, but with consideration of clear scope of responsibility and the level of flexibility. And lastly, since this is a new and adaptive process, improving monitoring and evaluation mechanisms are essential to make sure that the process are still going well. So all of these are just short insights on what we wrote in our recent policy papers that our colleague Ira and Dina wrote. And if you're interested, feel free to download it at this link, or you can also scan the barcode. With that, I will give it back to Luisa. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much, Felippa. That was a really great overview of the work CHIPS has been doing. And it actually leads in quite nicely to my first question for Asek Jean. You described very much about the e-commerce roadmap, but I'm curious if you can provide perspective for the audience a bit on the process of the development of this roadmap, and specifically how you engaged with the private sector to pull all of this together. I'm also curious what you found surprising in this process and what you view as coming next. Thank you.
Luisa, I love your question. It sounds like a cliche to me, but I'd like to tell you that really it's, they say that it's not the destination, right? It's the journey, right? I hope that I can share my slide. I tried to come up with the 10 minutes, but this particular roadmap is really a testimony of a private sector, public sector engagement. Crafting the roadmap is about direction, and if it weren't for the very active participation of private sector, we would not be able to get all of the strategies that are here. What we did in government, in DTI, is really just to facilitate it. Let me actually, can you go to the next slide? This is really, it started with the phase one. And if you can see, if you can pull it up a bit, phase one is really about engagement. You can see that's really something that we were strong on. I always say that I am not from the industry. When I was assigned to this, I know little about e-commerce. I don't even buy online because I'm a digital immigrant. I don't know these things, but I had to realize and I had to understand. It was the private sector, the platforms that helped us design what the ecosystem is all about. And understanding that ecosystem, a simple show, we have the graphs there, we have the charts there. We had to know who we should be talking to, the payments, the platforms. Even when you say platforms, it's not just it's a market. No, there's many platforms, and that we realize because of our engagement. And then the formulation process. That really went through a process, and then because of COVID, we kind of stopped it a bit, and we had to COVID-proof the plan. And by COVID-proofing the plan, we had to do a little bit of additional surveys for SMEs and also for platforms. But can we go along quickly, because the question is really how it was. So it's about engagement. Like, as you can see, I do have a slide really, because that's the journey is really we're focusing on how we did it. The entire plan, we started in August of 2019. That's where the secretary did his guidance. But after that, every step of the way, we had to talk to platforms, the payment, the logistics service providers, government. You have your enablers, all of the actors in e-commerce. How did we do it? We had to, because we it's like a film, Luisa. I always like to say that the e-commerce roadmap is like a low budget film. It's a low budget film, but it's star-studded. But we had to make do with thinking sessions, focus. We have brown bag brigade because we didn't feed people. So there, we talked about talk to private sector, public sector, and we even came up with like crowdsourcing. We in fact created the Viber community. Next slide. Sige, this is the direction setting. Come on, next slide, please. You see, we looked at it in various lenses. We had focus group discussions, and we had to make sure that we go deep dive. We talked to the payment platforms, the logistics providers. We have to talk to marketplaces, of course, the Lazada, Shopee, Zalora, the Gawin, the Service Pop, many platforms. And of course, we did also government. Next slide. When we were doing all of this, of course, this is the whole of government. We talked to government as well in a big way as well, and putting them all in one room. Next. Okay, that's the all of go. You can see that we did kind of a networking. We plotted which, and basically we realized really there's market access, digital. I mean, but that's not perfect though. Some are rainbow colored because some agencies do all of the priorities. And then the slide before that could be the last slide in terms of the journey. During the sessions, you remember that we talked about the stakeholders. We measured we had to find out the architecture. We realized that there were key themes that had to be addressed. Piracy was an issue. Digital taxation was an issue. Consumer protection was heavy. Data privacy, intellectual property, and even ease of doing business. So we did it. It's like horizontal, vertical, everything. We wanted to make sure that it's all bases covered. We put all of them together. We heard them, listened to them, and that's where we came out with a plan.
Thank you so much for that overview. That's very helpful and very clear that some of the recommendations Felippa suggested, you guys have already been implementing in terms of close cooperation with the private sector.
Right.
Luisa?
Sure. I just wanted, because Robbie is here, I also have to tell you that we really looked into all other resources, and we were invited by the World Bank, and the report of Robbie earlier on. We really took, Robbie would see that some of the most of it, in fact, most of the recommendations in the World Bank report, you could see in the e-commerce roadmap, because we affirm that those are really recommendations that we think we can adopt and which are really, in fact, supported by the sector. So thank you, World Bank.
That's
Thank you, IFC.
fantastic. I do want to throw in a bit of a challenging question. So, I mean, my next question for all panelists is about the speed at which technology changes. So my question is, even if there's ongoing dialogue between private sector and government, technology does innovate and change much more rapidly than, you know, bureaucratic policy making, legislation can be implemented, or regulations can get in place and fully implemented and enforced. So I'm curious, from your perspective, are there opportunities for a more iterative, flexible legal landscape or regulatory process, similar to maybe a regulatory sandbox, that will allow government and business to sort of adapt to the changes in technology in real time? And for the interest of time, I'm going to ask Asek Jean, followed by Felippa, and then Robbie to respond to this question.
Okay, I'll just maybe say it very briefly that we would like to see policies that are agnostic, and that that we don't really particularly promote or even encourage a particular technology. In fact, I would like to tell you now that we have ongoing efforts now to improve policy or amend certain laws that we have. Simply because of that, we have existing laws that are in particularly looking at a certain way of doing it. For example, in the case of digital signatures, but we are also part of a convention that really says that we shouldn't really, it should be really, as I like to use the word agnostic. So I am saying that we are mindful of that. That in terms of policy making, we do not regulate, we should not regulate technology, but really just principles behind, so that people will understand that, of course, the government has a primordial responsibility to its citizens, against all of the, against privacy, and consumer protection, and fraud. So these are the things that we are particularly concerned with.
Thank you for the question, Luisa. If I may add a little more on the potential legal landscape that allows for this adaptive iterative process. In addition to the regulatory sandbox, we also have some examples from Indonesia where the legislation are kept at a minimum baseline level to protect the consumers and also the businesses. But then the details of the recommendation, of the policies, excuse me, are in a code of conduct by the associations. For example, we see this in fintech sector. So the regulations exist, and they of course outline what are the minimum consumer protection mechanisms that must exist, or what are the minimum data privacy mechanisms that should exist. But in addition to that, associations can develop their own code of conducts. And through that, they are much more adaptive and can be easily and much more flexible in terms of adapting to new fintech innovations, for example. So that can be one potential new landscape to address this speed issue.
And from our end, we are fully supportive of these kinds of co-regulatory mechanisms, primarily because the problem in the Philippines is that a lot of our laws change very, very slowly. So, for example, we mentioned earlier the Public Services Act, right, which was drafted during the Philippine Commonwealth when we were still under, U.S. occupation. And the other thing is that, so for example, we are currently helping the government with, let's say, the national ID, where the idea is that we will have more, digital services available to people because we will now have a mechanism to identify them. But unfortunately, we have these old laws on from 1964 on data protection and data classification, sorry, which requires all these data to be kept by the government in paper form. right? So because of this, then a lot of this digitalization becomes difficult because when we're required to classify data and keep them on paper, then it defeats the purpose of going digital. But unfortunately, because these laws have not been changed, despite the passage of decades, we are stuck. So if we move towards a co-regulation mechanism, the private sector will be able to act more nimbly, and it will be faster for the government to change some of these requirements and not be stuck with with these kinds of laws or policies that were crafted decades when we were really all working with paper and pencil, which is very, very different from the technological advances that we now face today. And so also on that note, we're also happy that, as Jean mentioned us earlier, we have been in partnership with DTI in this space. In fact, when we wrote our digital economy paper, a lot of that were really thanks to inputs from them. In fact, the work that we had hoped to embark on with the postal services was really initiated with the help of Jean's office. So we're glad that they're taking on board our suggestions, primarily because a lot of these suggestions did also come from them and their stakeholders. So that's why these kinds of public-private dialogue, as Felippa mentioned, is really something that we espouse, and we are happy to continue doing that over time. Thank you. Back to you, Louisa.
Excellent. Thank you all for those insights. Thinking about SMEs, which you all have mentioned, and we know many are struggling to move online in the wake of COVID-19, and also just to keep pace with the growing digital economy around the world. So I'm wondering, is there a way for governments to respond quickly to the changing needs of small businesses and their consumer markets? And what can government and, let's say, business associations do to help support their sustainability through this transition, not just COVID, but sort of the digital transformation process? And Robbie, I'll start with you, and perhaps if you're interested to provide a regional perspective as well.
Thank you very much. So the first thing that we need to help SMEs with is becoming formal. And we've talked about it in many of our previous studies. Now, the Philippines, it's very, very difficult to set up a business. In Singapore, you can do it from the comfort of your home. You can, set up, especially an online business, within minutes. Where in the Philippines, there's a number of places that you will need to go to. You'll need to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the local government, if necessary. And so this is quite a difficult task. So I think the first thing that we need to do is really, if we want SMEs, especially e-commerce enabled SMEs, then the government has to be e-commerce enabled as well. It was quite disheartening that when during the pandemic, that the Bureau of Internal Revenue had made requests for SMEs to register, especially e-commerce SMEs, but they didn't have a mechanism for these SMEs to register online. So people would have to go to their nearest BIR office and physically go there, despite all these risks that they will now need to face by going to a physical space. So we're glad that just last week the government was able to complete the central business portal, which is a good step in this direction, so that that the government can now allow for us as small businesses to be able to register ourselves online from our homes. So, and this links the BIR, the SEC, and all the different entities. Eventually, all of the local governments will also be there. And so that's, I think, a major step that we can do, because, in the Philippines is actually does not do very well in this, especially registering a business. And of course, even closing a business is also difficult here. So the other thing that we are hoping that the government will also pursue is that, especially for SMEs, that are e-commerce based, the small ones, those that perhaps have no employees, that if they would not, we be exempted from local business registration requirements, because in essence, if you're an SME, you tend to work. If you're an e-commerce enabled entity, you work from home. You don't violate any zoning or environmental or laws or signages laws that the local governments tend to restrict. So again, this is something that's quite unique to the Philippines, wherein most entities have to register or even re-register every year to their local governments. If this is something that we can really explore to allow SMEs to develop, and we do have strong entities like the DTI that can enforce any fraud. And so, if you really allow them to operate much faster and become formal, that will really create all sorts of benefits, as as we don't restrict entrepreneurs, especially as they are still in the process of setting up. And the less we charge at the onset, the better.
Great, thank you. And Jean, do you want to discuss maybe how SMEs fit into the e-commerce roadmap you outlined?
Yes, I mentioned that. Thank you, Luisa. I remember that our tagline is market access, digitalization, and logistics integration. It's very simple to remember. So the digitalization there is the digitalization of SMEs and the digitalization of government. The question you asked earlier was about sustainability for SMEs and their role in e-commerce. I think the basic answer to that is really our focus on upskilling and reskilling. And the DTI in the roadmap that I've mentioned, because as I said earlier, we did COVID-proof it. We wanted to COVID-proof it. So we gave a survey during COVID to ask about SMEs. And the reason for this is that interventions by government should not be a one-size-fits-all. There's an ASEAN study. I think Felippa might probably know about it. The ASEAN study categorized SMEs as either basic, intermediate, or advanced. If you are a basic SME, that means that you have an email. If you are an intermediate SME, you sell online. But if you're an advanced SME, you actually you have a more sophisticated. You have data analytics. We did our survey, and the survey is again very with the Philippines. We have a level 0. Can you imagine that we have mobile phones, we have more mobile phones than population, but people don't use that to sell. So that's the thing that we need to come up with. We need to come up with skills, reskilling for each particular level, so that they would really be well prepared to enter and be more, and the businesses to grow even further. So that really is the strategy that will, moving forward, will be very focused on that.
So building off those thoughts, Felippa, I want to turn it back to you. Thinking about how much sort of trust and consumer protection have come up, and these in many ways fit into sort of the trust that needs to be built between the private sector and government, and things like a regulatory sandbox, which allows for sort of experimentation to take place, can be a great tool for this. I'm wondering if you could touch a bit more on how you see the role of central banks and other regulators to facilitate these initiatives, and in particular, how do these help maintain consumer trust, especially when so many new products are coming online?
Thank you, Luisa. That is an important question. First of all, I'd like to address that there's a myth that regulatory sandbox means businesses can just do whatever they want with their new products at a certain time, which is in reality not accurate. I think just like a sandbox that we picture, a physical sandbox, you have boundaries and you also have time. So essential regulations like consumer protection, data privacy, cybersecurity protections are still in place in the regulatory sandbox. But within that strict guidelines and within that clear guidelines, new companies can test out their new products and services. And within that experimentation period, close discussions are still held between the between the industry, the companies, as well as the regulators, allowing continuous monitoring and evaluation to happen with how the products are developing in the market. The key here is to capture the lesson learned from the regulatory sandbox to ensure that they are used to improve the regulations. And this has been done in many contexts and many instances, for example, in our own context with the fintech sector, but also in other countries like Singapore recently just published another report on their personal data privacy sandbox. And the experiments thus far have shown significant benefits that will actually increase consumer trust. Because a regulatory sandbox allows for innovation and business development. That's the first big thing. Usually when a new companies are set up, because of current regulations, sometimes they can take months up to years to be registered and to operate. But in a regulatory sandbox, that process is quicker. So it allows for innovation to be developed. And then secondly, it allows sharing of information. Again, that's a huge problem in digital economy. But within a regulatory sandbox, because of the continuous monitoring and dialogue that happens, policymakers are more informed about how a certain product is developing, how it's affecting consumers, etc. And then vice versa for companies themselves, they can also access guidance and advice from regulators during that time period when they're working on and experimenting something and they're trying to figure out how their product fits with a particular data provision. They can ask for advice and try to find the solution together with regulators. Fourth, it leads to improved design of policy that is actually applicable and enabling instead of limiting. Sometimes without that understanding of the new products and development, regulations have a risk of then limiting the new innovations. So having this regulatory sandbox can improve more evidence-based policymaking as well. And last but not least, through this dialogue, it enhances trust between the stakeholders, in particular companies and also regulators, because they share the same objective, they share the same processes of developing both the products and the policies. It actually enhances trust, which will be very beneficial when it comes to actually implementing the products and the policies later on. When you have that trust, it will actually seep up to consumer as well as it develops more a greater consumer protection mechanism that is effective both from the private sector and the government. So hopefully those processes can encourage consumers to adopt these new innovations.
Thank you, Felippa. You bring up several important points. Robbie, I'm curious from the IFC's perspective, I mean, what's making you all optimistic when it comes to digital transformation, not just in the Philippines, but the ASEAN region? And what sort of private sector investments is IFC looking at in the overall digital economy space?
So yes, it's quite exciting to be looking at this lens right now, primarily because you know the e-commerce market is really growing, and you know this is one of the few silver linings of this pandemic, which is really the expansion of all these markets. You know, you see a lot of, especially for example for digital payments, you see the tripling or quadrupling of all of the usage of, let's say, Gcash, Paymaya, and all these different digital wallets. You can see how e-services, especially in terms of restaurant food delivery, in terms of e-commerce, even brick and mortar companies like the SM Group is now moving very quickly to e-commerce. So it's really, it was highly unfortunate that we are suffering through this over the past year, but at the same time it is really also transformative in the sense, not just from the side of the consumer, but also from the side of the different companies. So that's why as IFC we are quite excited to play this role, to be able to finance some of these companies. But at the same time, I think the bigger part of e-commerce is the one that's less talked about, right? Because e-commerce is very, very inclusive. It allows a person who has who is operating in the remote parts of the Philippines, to the moment that they have a working cell phone, they can now sell either their services or whatever products they can have. And so it's really the transformative ability of e-commerce, both in terms of digital payments, the financial inclusion, the setting of bank accounts and digital wallets, the ability for us to to provide goods and services not just to the big cities but also globally. And so it's really the transformative and inclusiveness of e-commerce that we are really here to support. It is not as easy for us to invest in e-commerce companies, primarily because many times they're asset light. They start off very small and they grow very, very fast. Their funding requirements are ever changing, and so it also requires us as IFC to also shift paradigms, because the way we were investing in the past, in brick and mortar schools or factories or even infrastructure companies does not work when you're dealing with digital companies that grow, that can quadruple their revenues within weeks, right? So even for us, it's a learning experience, but we're really here to support this, of course, regionally, because of the fact that it has a very strong developmental capacity, especially when you talk about reaching, the unreached, the unbanked, and those that are not able to access, government and private services. So that's it from our end.
Thanks, Robbie. Actually, you kind of prepared us perfectly for the next question I have for all of you, which is, how can women and other marginalized groups sort of not just, transition online, but the first step tends to be to transition from unbanked to banked to then online and using e-payments. And there are many elements of the digital economy that is inclusive, but typically that remains a key barrier. So I'm curious if each of you, starting with Jean, then Felippa, then Robbie, can talk about this, and then we will switch over to the Q&A with the audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Louisa. Robbie mentioned earlier about the DTI having the business name registration system, and you can really see based on our data, more than 60% are women. Women in the Philippines, we rule the world. We rule the right, Robbie? So, and another important statistic, of course, that I agree with you tremendously, is that we have really more unbanked. About 44 million of them that are unbanked, and only 15 million, I think, are banked. And if you look at the statistics of the Bureau of the Bangko Central, about 29% only are have a bank account. So in the plan, and this is again when I say that it's about an all of e-government approach, this is where we are working very closely with the Bangko Central. You would remember that I mentioned to you that we did a survey on digitalization of SME. So we asked them, are you aware of digital payment schemes? Are you aware of an e-wallet or a mobile wallet? And more than half said they don't. They are not aware. But when we started saying, do you know, when it became an assisted, do you know GCash, PayMaya? Then now the awareness level increased. But we asked them, for those of you who are aware and who are using, how many of you who are aware are actually using? So we now know which of the gateways. But do you know what? Almost 70% don't use it for business, and lesser, but they do use it anyway for personal. So what do I mean? That education is something that we are very mindful and cognizant of. So that's why when we do, and this is something that we're excited to work with BSP, it's important to say, why are you, when they said, why are you not using e-wallet? My customers are not using it. Or I don't find the need for it. And of course, the third is I don't know how. So together with private sector, the banks, the payment, the PMMI, the associations, the fintechs, we need to band together for a very massive scale of teaching or educating people on the importance and how to do it. It's quite simple. So the challenge is quite interesting. It's not all bad. It's not a bad of roses, but I think because of the greater engagement between private sector and public sector, as we did it with, I think nothing's impossible.
Thank you, Jean. I think that was a really good start. Just to add on that, I completely agree with what Jean is saying. And I think in addition to that, I would like to highlight the necessary consumer protection and data protection mechanism, especially when you're talking about that step about moving from unbanked to banked. In Indonesia, it is also a huge problem. Only about 18% of Indonesians have access to capital from banks. We know that so many more Indonesians borrow, but they tend to borrow from informal loan agencies, which there's a risk of higher interest rates. Now that e-lending is here and P2P lending is here, peer-to-peer lending, there's huge opportunities for them to access capital. But then there's risk because women and marginalized communities, they also tend to be less digitally literate with informations, accessing terms and conditions. So that's why strong consumer protection as well as data protection mechanisms is crucial. In Indonesia, so many women and poor communities fall victim into like predatory lending, and so many issues like aggressive loan collection mechanisms. We actually at CHIPS are making another report that's launching very soon on consumer protection on P2P lending to address this particular issue. But moving on from after having access to capital, when you're now setting up a business for women and marginalized communities, I completely agree with what Robbie and Asek was saying earlier about the need to reduce barriers, especially for micro businesses, for them to enter the digital economy. Women are a majority of the micro entrepreneurs in Indonesia, but they also have a unique challenge when they're accessing digital economy because they tend to have less capital. They also have less time usually because they have to take care of unpaid care work at home. They also tend to have less information dealing with all of the registration. Although there are great efforts in Indonesia to put everything online, having all the registration set up online. Still, the process is sometimes you have to go through multiple windows, you have to submit multiple documents, verify everything, and that's quite hard for women. So a lot of these women, they just decided to not formalize and just leave and move to another businesses that are easier for them. So when it's time to set up a businesses, I completely agree about reducing those barriers, especially for women and marginalized communities, exempting them from licensing requirements, for example. That would be some of the recommendations.
So I agree with what Felippa and Asik Jean have mentioned on the exclusion and the women, and we're happy that if as more things move online, it actually facilitates the access of these services to women. So I think beyond this, we're also quite concerned about the other digital divide. Of course, not to downplay the inclusiveness of gender, but there's also the other issue, especially in the Philippines, wherein the other divide is the fact that some people don't even have access to the basic telecom services. And I think that's a key concern. Mobile broadband penetration in the Philippines, for example, is at 72%. But in the rest of ASEAN, it's at 82%, right? We know that even with this kind of mobile broadband network, many times, you get dropped calls. You can't do a Zoom meeting, let alone register your business, especially if you're making a digital payment and the transaction gets cut off midway through. This is the only funds that you have, it's quite scary to not figure out whether the money was actually transmitted. And so I think this is one key area that we really need to focus on also is the rollout of our digital infrastructure, because all this talk about e-commerce, will be bogged down if you actually have no signal and cannot pay or cannot transact, right? So that's number one. And number two is that you also have the other digital divide in terms of literacy. So, for example, as the Philippines started to try to roll out, these contact tracing apps and all these COVID response tools, you kind of realize that many people don't have smartphones, or worse, that they have a smartphone but they don't know how to set up a password. They don't know how to fill in all this space. Many times these apps are done in English, so if they are not able to understand what's being asked of them, it becomes quite difficult. So we also need to look at these two other digital divides on top of gender, which are access to digital services, and also the ability to be literate and to be digital savvy enough to be able to do these even simple tasks that for us it's pretty rudimentary, straightforward, right? If you're used to checking in online or checking your Facebook every other day, I mean, these things become second nature to us. But for many people, this is the first time they will be required to do these things. and therefore really need to upskill our people also, so that they can access more and more of these kinds of services.
Great, thank you all so much. And building off this question, we have a question from the audience. This one is for Asak Jean. So women entrepreneurs are often among key beneficiaries of e-commerce. And are you seeing this trend in the Philippines specifically?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier on, I noticed that when we do really surveys about who are attending our sessions and how many have registered, you really can see that many of them are women. That is why we are very happy that basically all the efforts and initiatives is we're doing a little bit of some contribution in terms of our gender programs. So yes, the answer is to that is yes. We are do focus and do see women in our initiatives.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to ask the audience to submit any questions for the panelists. And I am taking a few of them now. This one comes from Jose Mari Garcia for Robbie. It says, when you say revitalize PhilPost as an anchor for parcel delivery, especially in remote communities, what operational strategies are you looking into?
So DTI was the one that spearheaded the initial discussions with PhilPost. So I think I'll defer to Asik Jean subsequently. But I
Yeah.
think one of the things that we are looking into is some sort of public-private partnership. It's not necessarily the privatization of PhilPost, but more in terms of allowing third parties greater access to some of their assets. Perhaps looking at co-managed facilities, providing services together, because PhilPost's reach is quite dense, and many entities are unable to access these these remote barangays, as we mentioned, right? So partnering with PhilPost, allowing third parties to be able to accredit with them so that they can do joint services. Some of these are already being done, but to have these things more formally done would be good. We need to have more discussions. ASEC, I think we still have to meet with the Postmaster General so that we can really come up with a workable plan, because we haven't looked into this as greatly as we should have been. We did start these discussions and meetings in March 2020. And of course, we know what happened subsequently after that. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to revisit this idea, but we really need to go back hand in hand with DTI, because they're the ones that are in contact with the officers of PhilPost.
Yeah. So I'd like to add to that very briefly that yes, when we realized the importance of PhilPost, it was actually again the private sector who brought that attention to us. It was always about the easiest way to say is, we would like to see the Philippine Postal Corporation that's similar to the U.S. Postal Service. That's how efficient that it would be. And the next thing that they really said, I'm talking about them, the private sector, the logistics service providers. They said that, of course, of all the institutions here in the country, no one can beat, no private sector can beat the warehouses and the infrastructure of PhilPost. So if there are many areas that cannot be reached by the private sector, because these are routes that missionary routes, they cannot be reached in the boondocks of the country, but our postal service will be there to deliver the mail. So we want that particular the technology that the private sector, I have heard them in our conversations with the Postmaster General and the PhilPost team is quite positive, because they're actually telling us what particular business model can be done. So in fact, we're already looking at possibility with the PPP for public-private partnerships. And another important information that I could share with you was a very generous offer by QuadX during the e-commerce launching. They did say, in the Philippines, the post office code, the postal code, the postal code is a 4-digit code. But we have 300,000 barangays. So it was very difficult for the parcel delivery to locate it. So what the private sector said to PhilPost, we will be donating to you if you wish what we devise as a postal code that can actually be used in the entire country. So these are the things that, I mean, private sector said that, and the important thing is we try to see, we facilitate, and we hope to talk to PhilPost, and again the private sector, bring them all in, discuss, and see where this will lead us.
Great, thank you both. Building off that question and perhaps a bit into the weeds, we have a question from John Forbes. So the Philippines Department of Justice has a longstanding opinion that small package deliveries is a public utility, which limits foreign ownership to 40%. Apparently this can be changed without waiting for the PSA amendments, which is currently still in the Senate. I suppose there's an option to respond to that from Asak, Jean, or Robbie, but also the question is, does Indonesia allow foreign ownership for domestic logistics operators? Felippa, if you're able to answer that.
Mr. John Forbes, I tried to answer the questions posted by Luisa, but this time I would like to take a pass. Can I just get back to you? I really don't feel comfortable. I need to understand everything before I say something wrong. So I'd have to pass, and I'll get back to you, Mr. John Forbes, I promise.
Absolutely. Of course. And Felippa, I'm not sure if you want to take this on or we can also pass.
Sure. I think based on my knowledge thus far, there are opportunities for foreign businesses to also invest and own domestic logistics company. We are also right now in the midst of updating and reforming our investment investment regulation. So there will be updates in a couple of months to come regarding foreign ownership in domestic logistics. But just a short answer, I think yes.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to kind of go back to some of the original elements of our conversation. And we have a question about the role of local government when it comes to the enabling environment for the digital economy to thrive. Can you share some thoughts on sort of the role you see for maybe provincial and city government?
Maybe I'll take a crack. Okay, so one of the things that is very essential, this was mentioned already by Robbie, was on business registration. Many private sector complaints to us that how can you do e-commerce when government is not online? That really strikes a chord, and for that particular reason, we have to make sure that the local governments are actually equally have streamlined their processes, and that is relevant or responsive to online businesses. This is I was just texting Robbie privately, but we are actually we're working with ARTA, because the Anti-Red Tape Authority has a plan to issue regulation, and in that regulation we said that we should add something on businesses of a particular industry classification, which is on internet retail. So that's something that's really quite consistent with what Robbie said. But as of now, I have to tell you that there are already businesses, there are already local government units that are actually working with us, because DTI is a registration as a business name registration system. So they are now even with the system of DTI, we are working with the local government, so that when people check your document and they ask for a business name registration, all they need to do is to check it with our system. We are API integrated, if I may, that will be the proper description for it. So that really is important, which is for our local government units to have an efficient or online business registration. The next item there is policy coherence. What you go to one, a platform would complain to us. They would go to one LGU with a different ordinance and a different requirement, and go to another LGU, and they would be expected to do a different requirement or registration requirement. So that one would be the number, the priority that we are going to have to deal with and address.
If I
Great.
may
And
add,
sure.
oh, sorry. I completely agree about that business registration part. I think also similarly in Indonesia, local governments are the first gate for businesses to register. On top of that, I think the local governments also have an opportunity and a space to be more active in terms of increasing digital literacy for the community. They are much more closer to the community. Here in Indonesia, for example, the education system is very decentralized, so local governments have the opportunity to increase, integrate digital literacy curriculum and digital literacy trainings and programs to the community. So you're also increasing awareness from the community when they're entering digital economy.
Great, thank you. And Felippa, I have a question for you from our director at SIPE for our Asia region. The question is, given the explosive growth of e-commerce that you outlined, what are the potential bottlenecks that could constrain future growth? Sorry, that comes from John Morel.
Thank you, John, for the question. Some of the potential bottlenecks that can constrain future growth, I think right now, regulations and over-regulations. There are risks that because the governments are trying to figure out how best to protect consumers, they tend to go over step a bit and then limit the potential growth. For example, right now we have a moratorium on fintech industries, so no new peer-to-peer lending platforms can be registered while they're trying to figure out this consumer protection regulations. So there are some potential bottlenecks in regulations. The second one, business registration. I think it's a constant theme in our current discussions. I think business registration in Indonesia, we also still have a low ease of doing business index. So that can also be potential bottlenecks. The third one is regulations around investments as well. Indonesia is making broad steps and progress in that area, particularly in the current investment regime. I think we're much more open to foreign investments, especially in tech sector, but that can be an area that may make or break the tech industry, not just for foreign investments, but also domestic investments. How can we encourage domestic investments to come into the sector? I think those three would be the areas where I would watch.
Great, thank you. That's a really important perspective. I want to now ask a question to Asek Jean. This also comes from John Morel regarding the Basta e-commerce. And what are the key market institutions that you see need to be reformed or strengthened for promoting breakthrough outcomes in the e-commerce sector in the Philippines?
When we say market access, it's really about making sure that it will facilitate cross-border e-commerce transactions. And even in the domestic front, even when you do onboarding, that's already market access. When you do onboarding to a particular platform, that's how simple it is. But the way it is now, it's not simple for our SMEs. It's very difficult for them. And that particular gap, we need to narrow down that gap and make life easy for them. So when we say, for example, it's quite difficult, I understand, to go into cross-border because, getting into Amazon, for example, is quite difficult. Not many can actually go there. If you go even to Lazada, for instance, they go through a specific process. So not all SMEs that we actually refer that or we encourage to go on board don't really quite get into don't get into it. So the need to do that is to really enable our micro, small, and medium enterprise, to prepare them so that they would be able to get into the online sphere. there are so many fly by nights, and we don't want that. We really want legitimate. And this is, again, we go to the issue of registration. Why do we encourage registration? Because when you register, not only are you helping your business, because if you're registered, you can issue receipts, you can have suppliers, people know that you actually exist and trust you. It is also best for consumers. That really is the double feature why we are actually working on registration. But you see that in the case of the Philippines, many, we know that they're not registered, and they go through either social media, and that's actually where we'd like to really kind of make it more robust. I hope I answered the
Excellent.
question.
Yes, and actually I have a follow-up from my colleague Ryan Evangelista, which is DTI tracking OECD and USTR updates on digital taxes? And you're talking about registration. So I'm wondering if you can maybe mention what the e-commerce plan, kind of how it addresses digital taxation.
All right. Of course, I would like to start my statement by saying that discussions on digital taxation, we really have to defer to the Department of Finance. So that would be the basic statement that I'd like to make. In fact, but this I have to tell you that. In the course of the discussion in e-commerce, really taxation is a major factor. That is why you can see there that that taxation was a topic in one of the brown bag sessions that we've made. We invited precisely the Bureau of Internal Revenue because of issues relative to taxation. I can also tell you, maybe as an update, that there is really, in fact, an Internet Transactions Act that is now being discussed in Congress. But I must point to the fact that that digital taxation is not covered in that act, because there is a bill that is also currently pending in Congress on digital taxation. So I guess I'd leave it at that. That there are already ongoing policy reviews and possible legislation that is going through the engagement process. As I've said, the digital taxation bill has been discussed in Congress, and I think that will sort of give a little bit of preview of where government is going relative to taxation.
Great, thank you. And the audience can certainly look that up. Sure, Robbie, please go ahead.
Can I just add something quickly? I mentioned earlier the Bureau of Internal Revenue. So during the COVID pandemic, they had required or requested for all these SMEs to register their businesses, especially those who were in e-commerce. But ironically, most of these people were basically people who had recently been taken out of the job and were selling goods that they had online. What this means is that they're actually already registered with the Bureau of Internal Revenue as people, right? They already were issued their tax identification number, and so it actually wasn't a requirement to register. It was a requirement to change their classification, which again could have been done online or with a phone call, but yet you have to physically visit the bureau. So I think this is where we want to also look at, is that if we want to talk about digital taxation, we also need to talk about e-commerce taxation and making it easier for basically for e-commerce entities to actually pay taxes and issue receipts. Because even today, the Bureau of Internal Revenue requires paper copies of the receipts, especially if you have to do an audit. So think of it this way: if I am, let's say, a consultant and I provide you with a service, I actually need to physically send you a piece of paper after we provide our service, because you might be needing this paper receipt. So we still need to do a lot of work on getting rid of the paper, right? To make it easier for people to issue electronic receipts, to make it easier for people to work with electronic copies of paper receipts, so that they don't have to, to keep or request for the actual physical copies with the signatures, right? So I think there's a lot of the work has been done with these Internet Transactions Act in terms of what is allowed, what can be digitized. But when you look at the processes about doing audits, doing both from the Commission on Audit and the Bureau of Internal Revenue, when you need to do all this work with the government in particular, a lot of our old policies and practices still require wet signatures and pieces of paper. So if you work on that, right, we can actually do a lot more in, capturing a lot of the revenues from the government side, no, through taxation. But the key is to actually make it easier to register the bureau, to pay taxes, and to also, to issue receipts and to be able to collect the taxes. Because again, these things are a drag to the system, because you can think of everything is now online, except for the forms that you need to provide, to do the withholding tax payments, to do the issuances of receipts, to print these paper receipts. I mean, these things still are, unfortunately, still in the, non-digital space.
Thanks so much for that overview. And I mean, certainly we're seeing those same exact issues in numerous countries around the world. I think taxation remains one of the most challenging parts of the digital transformation process in business. I want to make sure we save a few minutes for Ryan Evangelista to share some thoughts. But Felippa, I'm going to ask you the final question. So you have brought up the code of conduct in business associations, and that's certainly a constituency that SIPE cares a lot about. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, how business associations can play a larger role in this overall digital transformation process and dialogue with government, especially where there may be weak policy right now, and sort of what you're seeing in Indonesia and any recommendations you might have for business communities throughout the ASEAN region.
Thank you, Louisa, for that question. Yes, I think business associations and businesses in general do have a significant role to play here. I think the public-private dialogue and the co-regulation goes both ways. You cannot just wait for the government to set up the space for you, but business associations have a role to also pursue and push for co-regulation in this space. And we see this a lot in Indonesia, where you have the e-commerce associations, you have the business associations, the fintech associations, all pushing for more dialogue, approaching the government first to set up these dialogues and providing inputs on regulations, for example, because right now in Indonesia, as I said, the digital economy framework is spread across 14 different ministries and agencies. Some of them are much more advanced and some of them are much more open to dialogue. Some of them tend to be a little bit hesitant, or maybe they're just not aware or not familiar with the process. So with these ministries, especially who are not yet open to dialogues, business associations should be, and they're already proactive in pursuing dialogue with governments, but not just between businesses and governments. They also would be beneficial if they open up the space to civil society, to consumers, to all of those micro businesses that may not be captured by the big associations yet. So I think those are the roles. It goes both ways. Thank you, Louisa.
Thank you. And Sakjin, I'm going to put you on the spot for a final thought. What would you like to see business and government do cooperatively right now to kickstart the e-commerce adoption and digital transformation in the Philippines?
I'd go for the lowest hanging fruit. The lowest hanging fruit and the easiest. Easiest, but not to minimize the word easy, right? But based on the discussions, the engagement with the private sector, the problems. I'm not saying that if you notice, the strategies are based on the problems that we saw, and this would be the answers. But I think the lowest hanging fruit is to increase advocacy. We need to inform our people. We need to educate our people. No one will. I believe that we know about the need to improve regulation. We need to register, making sure that there's ease of doing business. But all things being equal, the here, the now, the 108 million Filipinos and the 173 mobile phones that are already there doing Facebooking, but not buying, not selling. Why? If we see that, you please get your e-wallets. That's safer than paying in cash. It's more expensive. These are the simple things, the advocacy portion. If we put the resource, because government does not have too much resources on that, but if private sector and government, the associations will band ourselves together and always do basta e-commerce, it's like to the point of indoctrination. I don't know if I should say that, but this thing, let's do it. It's fast, it's convenient, it's safe. Don't do anything bad because you're giving e-commerce a bad name. Things like that. More e-commerce, more jobs, more enterprises, more jobs. I think that's really the number one that we can do. Lowest hanging fruit.
Yes, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. And I think on that note, especially the note on advocacy, I want to turn it over to Ryan, who has a lot of experience in the advocacy and private sector space in the Philippines, to close us out. And thank you to all the speakers for your insights and thoughts today. Ryan?
Thank you so much, Louisa. And my big heartfelt thanks to our panelists, Asik Jean, Robbie, and Felippa. I'm connected to all of you somehow, one way or the other, with the previous work that I've done and affiliations with your organizations, because you have been a tremendous asset to your respective fields and your countries and the organizations represent. Asik Jean, it's always nice to see you. It's always a privilege to be with you and work with you. ASIC Jean is I'm a fellow governance fellow with ASIC Jean at the Institute for Solidarity in Asia. And we work closely in advocating, advancing governance reform. And she's a chief architect, one of the chief architects in DTI's governance transformation. And it shows clearly with the e-commerce roadmap that was laid down with a very multi-stakeholder approach to it and a process that has indeed enjoined civil society, private sector, and consumer groups together. So a big congratulations for the wonderful launch, and I look forward to the success of your team and the government in implementing this program. And Robbie, of course, having also worked with World Bank and number of projects and initiatives, I know for a fact World Bank is investing heavily on promoting and supporting linkages between small and medium enterprises and the bigger supply chain network. And as he highlighted on the logistics aspect, which is one of the critical assets or facets for digital economy to prosper globally, indeed the supply chain linkages is something that needs to be further strengthened. I think it cuts across every business opportunity for small and medium enterprises to thrive. And Felippa, congratulations with your work on CHIPS. CHIPS is a wonderful partner of the Asia Think Tank Network that we also spearhead and facilitate over at SIPE. And we're very happy that with this policy paper briefs that you're undertaking, we're able to learn more and share knowledge across ASEAN countries like the Philippines and other regional partners to benefit from the experience of Indonesia, but also from the experience of enhancing and expanding our regulatory mechanisms where the private sector can drive further opportunities to engage with the government and opportunities to strengthen collaboration. On that note, it's really a great privilege to have you in this maiden program that we in the Manila office have put together with our friends and our colleagues from the DC office. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our management team in DC, in Washington, DC, Andrew, Abdu, John, and the rest of the team for their warm support and warm welcome to the family. It's such a great privilege and honor to be in this opportunity to lead the office, but more importantly, to collaborate with the broader site ecosystem around the world and be able to harness basically the potential of the region in cascading a lot of the work and the initiatives of SIPE. So we look forward to many more opportunities to work together. And my special thanks go to the global team, particularly to Louisa and Adam and Morgan and Anna, the entire team for shepherding the global the digital economy theme and cascading it down for us here to support broader interaction with our stakeholders in the region. I'd also like to thank our comms team for their wonderful assistance in putting the logistics and infrastructure together. Such an amazing team that we operate under these conditions globally, but still in cohesion with the mandate, with the mission and vision of SIPE. So thank you to all our friends and colleagues at the Asia team as well. But more importantly, we're starting in a very modest ground, and I'm very happy that the management team has took a chance in investing in the Manila office at the height of the pandemic. So I couldn't thank enough our management team for this tremendous support on our regional efforts. But I'd like to just acknowledge my very modest team, Srijana and Janessa, for being the pillar of really putting together our programs and looking forward to many more opportunities to work together. In the end, I think we have been exposed to the digital economy and the realms of the possibilities of the digitalization around the world. But I think, as pointed out by the wisdom of our panelists, it is important to re-shepherd broader public-private dialogue, advocacy, strengthen our connection and digital contact points for micro, small, and medium enterprises and consumers to become self-aware of the transformation and the possibilities and opportunities when we migrate to a more digital business and e-commerce framework. On the other hand, we need to continue the dialogue in as far as strengthening the regulatory framework. And as Robbie pointed out, expand that to the digital infrastructure that needs to be balanced off so that we can democratize exactly the benefits of the digital economy in the space for us to benefit from it. In the end, in the how we program things at the site office, both in globally and in the Philippines, this is certainly one of the topics that we continue to embrace and provide and hopefully foster more discussions in future work, because we want to really shepherd a robust and rich framework in which private sector and the government can come together on a common ground in supporting each other, but also coming up with measurable indicators, as pointed out by the good e-commerce roadmap that the Philippines has produced, so that we can really look at the benefits and transform many of our micro, small, and medium enterprises and consumers to the kind of leverage that they can be supported with digitalization. So on that note, I would like to again thank you, all of you from wherever part of the world you may be now. Please stay safe, everyone. Stay healthy, and we look forward to more of these discussions, but hopefully in a physical environment in the near future. On that note, maraming salamat from our side here in Asia, and thank you so much again for your active participation.